So here's the messy phylogeny of the protists, actually all the eukaryotes. So here's our bacteria, archaea, and all the eukaryotes. And here's in gray the animals, the fungi, and the plants. And here are the close relatives, the green algae. We'll include the green algae as a protist. And you can see the enormous molecular phylogenetically based cladistics that have defined all the major clades, including these big names like Alveolata, Stramenophiles, Rhizaria, and some you've heard of before, like Plantae. And I don't like this word, but we'll leave that for another day. So basically, everything that's colored in on this phylogeny are the groups called protists. In your textbook, we cover a lot of the different groups, the Euglenas, the Ciliates, really cool groups. These early groups are really funky. Um, you're not going to need to know these big names of the clades. We're going to learn these groups this semester, the dinoflagellates, the diatoms, the brown algae, the amoebozoans. As we continue on, we'll also learn some of the other algal groups that are closely related to plants and animals and fungi as well when we get there. Um, Today, we really use DNA to figure out the relationships of these, and these names up here often are defined based on some organelles or special structures within the cells that close members turn out to be synapomorphies for. But you don't need to know these details. We're just going to focus on a wide range of pretty unrelated, but in some ways similar, in other ways quite different types of phylogenetics within these groups. So let's talk about the diatoms and the dinoflagellates first. So the dinoflagellates are probably the weirdest group of protists that have ever lived. They're so bizarre. They're all single-celled or unicellular. They're all plankton, meaning they float around in the water. When it comes to their metabolism, some are photosynthetic, like this one. They have chloroplasts, they're phytoplankton. Other ones are heterotrophic and don't have chloroplasts, so they're zooplankton. Some are both. During the day, they harness the sun as photosynthetic phytoplankton, and then when the sun goes down at night, they become heterotrophs. Weird, weird, weird stuff. They only live in the oceans. The technical word for this is marine. Okay, there's a few that live close, like where a lake, or sorry, not a lake, a river feeds into the ocean, like in Louisiana. They might be able to survive there, but they need salt water. Um, the name Dinoflagellata, you might think of meaning die, meaning two, and in fact they have two flagellae, two of these little whip-like structures. Let me show a picture and we'll come back to this. And so if you see a scanning electron microscope picture of these or a regular microscope picture, you can see this is the cell. It's a weird looking cell. This is a fake color. This is like Photoshop. They don't look red or yellow or orange, but they have a groove in their shell. And then we call this technically a test. A test is a fancy word for a microscopic shell. It's like a cell wall made out of protein. Um, and out of that cell test are two flagella, a short flagellum and a long flagellum. And when it's time to swim, they pull out their flagella and then they whip around. Because of these grooves, they can kind of pull their flagellum in and kind of stop moving. But when they're moving, because they have two different, it's like imagine a bird trying to fly with a long wing and a short wing, they're going to spin. And so the word dino here is the same root as like dynamite, meaning to explode, to spin, literally. And if you see these alive, they're spinning because of these offset flagellae that move them around. And so that's technically the etymology. It means spinning flagellae, not two, although they do have two flagellae. This word test is a fancy word that's used with protists when we talk about kind of microscopic, kind of cell walls that are kind of crusty in some way. When you see the word organic used in this context, it usually means made out of proteins. Proteins are pretty strong and resilient. And one thing they can do is with this protein test is they can hibernate. They can sink to the bottom of the ocean and kind of wait until the environment gets better for them to go back to feeding and survive. They can kind of hibernate inside this protective test, even though it's a single cell, which is pretty cool. Metabolically, very weird, very diverse. Most of these are photosynthetic, although some are heterotrophic at the same time. So they might be photosynthetic during the day, heterotrophic at night. Um, a lot of them, and we'll see this later on, live within the skin of animals. So there are certain trees. There are certain animals. The most famous are corals. The things that make up a coral reef are animals, but they tend to have dinoflagellate colonies living within their skin, and in a way, the skin allows the dinoflagellates to do photosynthesis because the skin's really thin. And in the process, the coral gets some free sugar, some free food out of it. So corals can't do photosynthesis, but if they have dinoflagellates living in their skin, they can actually kind of gain the benefits of photosynthesis. So chemically, metabolically, a little bit weird. Some of these do a weird chemical trick called bioluminescence, where they glow in the dark. It's a similar concept as lightning bugs, but it's a convergent way of doing a chemical process. And so they can glow instead of glowing like a yellowish color like lightning bugs do. They tend to glow bluish, which is kind of cool. And then some of these are kind of toxic. This is an application. When we cover groups of life, part of our biodiversity should be why do they matter? What's their ecological role? Where are they within the food chain? But also, why do they matter to humans? And so, a lot of food poisoning for seafood often is because of dinoflagellates. So, if you eat some bad clams or some bad mussels and get nauseous later that night and get food poisoning, get sick, vomit. Often it's not that the clams were bad, it's that the clams were eating algae in the water and they ate some phytoplankton, some dinoflagellates, and the dinoflagellates that they were eating happened to be ones that produced weird chemicals. A lot of the chemicals are neurotoxic, which means that they affect human or animal nervous systems. And so, especially if you have food poisoning that makes you feel dizzy or tingly, or when you're vomiting, you feel a little dizzy or tingle, often that's a sign that you had dinoflagellate food poisoning. Usually doesn't kill humans. It's usually kind of a weird kind of a weird food poisoning, shellfish, seafood poisoning. Some of these can also do what's called a red tide. So one of the things with single-celled things is they reproduce quickly. So if the conditions are right, there's some fertilizer, some runoff, some pollution in the water. Maybe a farm released too much fertilizer into the water. Maybe there's a sewage outbreak that released a lot of nitrogen, which is a common fertilizer for photosynthetic things. They can go from small numbers of algae to enormous numbers of algae overnight very quickly. And so what looked like healthy water the day before, you wake up and is now red. So photosynthesis is usually green, but when we talk about protists, sometimes they take on weird colors, brownish, reddish, some other colors. And so this water looks like it's polluted, but what it is there's an enormous outbreak of dinoflagellate algae, and they tend to call this a red tide when this happens. And in some cases, the algae is neurotoxic. So if you go swimming here or drink this water, or in the coastal area where the water kind of gets pushed up into the air and you breathe it into your lungs, you can get injured from certain red tides. Sometimes it's just kind of nasty. Sometimes it can be toxic. In olden days, before we didn't understand science, people often said that this was a sign from God, that God was angry because the oceans turned to blood. It looks like blood, but it's probably an outbreak of dinoflagellates. And then we'll talk about the reproduction in a minute. So let's kind of see some pictures of these. So here's what dinoflagellates look like because of their protein test. They often can come in a lot of different sizes and shapes. Actually, the sizes are all basically your normal 10 to 100 microns. So not really visible with the naked eye. If you have really good eyesight and you know they're there, you might be able to see them. Okay, um, this is the bioluminescence. I've personally experienced this. It was one of the most magical kind of experiences with nature I've ever had. Typically, they glow when the water is disturbed, usually in springtime, which happens to be a reproductive time. Why they glow is a huge unanswered mystery. One hypothesis that's consistent with them glowing in the spring is that they're doing it to reproduce. So maybe remember in sexual reproduction, meiosis, they have to fertilize. And so you have to find a mate. And so it could be the glowing is a way to find a mate, just like lightning bugs glow to find a mate. That doesn't make sense in this case because they don't have eyes, so they can't really perceive light. So how can they find a mate if they glow, if they can't see a mate? So that hypothesis isn't so great. Another possible hypothesis is that they're doing it as a defensive mechanism. And this seems to make a bit more sense. You'd think, well, why would you glow if you're trying to scare off something that's eating you? The argument here is that if something like a zooplankton is going to eat you, maybe you're not trying to scare off the zooplankton that's also microscopic, but by glowing, you lure a fish. You basically call attention to yourself, and a fish comes and eats the thing that's trying to eat you. So it could be a defensive mechanism. The genus or the species is one of my favorite species names, Noctiluca cinnamans. The genus part means nightlight, literally, and the species part means flickering or glowing, the glowing nightlight. Really cool thing. If you've ever spent time in the oceans in spring, this is often a common experience and a really kind of magical thing, but now we know it's just these single-celled protists. Okay, if you look up close and personal in a little coral that makes a coral reef, you might see some blotches of color in the skin. These are usually colonies of dinoflagellates. The skin is clear. Sunlight comes into the skin, lets the dinoflagellates get some sunlight, do photosynthesis, and this is a partnership where the animal is getting free food and the algae is getting some protection. It doesn't have to worry about living on its own if it basically can be protected by these bigger corals that protect it. Okay, let's talk about the life cycle of this. So, way back when, and not too long ago, we were talking about meiosis, mitosis, fertilization, ploidy, haploid, diploid. So the life cycle of a dinoflagellate tends to be asexual. 99% of the time they reproduce by mitosis, asexually. But they are capable of sex, of doing meiosis. Some things you just need to memorize it. If you're a dinoflagellate, the typical cell, like up in here, if you go to the nucleus, look at the chromosomes, they have unpaired chromosomes, they are haploid. And so let's go through the life cycle of a dinoflagellate. We're going to see tons of these, so we'll go through this slowly, but it's important that you understand these. Okay, so here's the typical life cycle of a dinoflagellate. It's got its paired flagellae, it's got its weird shaped cell with a test around it. Our scale bar, you can't see it here, is about 10 microns. So this is about 0.1 millimeters in diameter, and they just do asexual reproduction. It's haploid, it does mitosis, it produces haploid babies, and this is the normal life cycle. But typically in the spring, at least in the northern hemisphere, spring in the southern hemisphere too, but it's offset by 6 months, they can do sex. And so here's how the sexual phase of the life cycle happens. They are haploid, so in essence, they're like adult sperm, adult eggs. They're the gametes. We'll call them gametes, but technically there are no gametes here. They're just haploid cells, just like sperm and egg cells are. They find each other, maybe by glowing. They fertilize each other, and the two cells become one cell. We normally call that fertilization. You go from two haploid cells into a single cell called a zygote that's diploid. This is the union of both parents. The parents don't exist anymore. They are now one cell. It's kind of cool, kind of romantic. Kind of like, I now pronounce you not just man and wife, but you're now actually becoming one single cell, one organism. Pretty cool. You don't get better than that. And then they can hunker down in this stage, kind of form a cyst, live in that protein shell, sink to the bottom of the ocean, wait for sunny weather or the right conditions to burst out. Then they do meiosis. Takes a lot of energy to do this, and then they go from diploid to haploid, and then they go back to living. So if you should be familiar with these life cycles. If you want to practice, a good way to learn these life cycles is go to D2L, look at the pictures with all the words missing and be able to recognize, is an arrow mitosis? Is it meiosis? Is it fertilization? What's haploid? What's diploid? Point to anything. Find the gamete, find the zygote. Um, a good reminder is that the color typically changes. So if this is all reddish or dark gray, it's all going to be haploid or diploid. And then everything between this bar and the bar again is going to be the opposite. Okay, so the color tells you where it's switching between diploid and haploid. This is a weird life cycle to you, but if you're a dinoflagellate, this is normal life cycle.